Surprise, surprise. This is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. And with me from Oklahoma, but in St. Louis, is Ryan Turnipseed.
Hello. How are
Welcome.
you doing?
Thank you. We had fun. Maybe we'll tell you another time. Ryan got here safely despite an ice storm. That's the good news. But then there was some adventure when he got here. Anyway, okay, so yeah, Ryan's here because we'll be off with my wife tomorrow to go to Nashville for the conference we've been mentioning, where Ryan and I will both be speaking, as well as Charlemagne and who'd we have on recently? Prudentialist was recently on the show, and others. So that should be fun. But if you're not going already, I suspect you're missing it. So no point in talking too much about that. Mention real quick before we get into a little current events at the top of the show that we have support for the show through Subscribestar. 90% of our supporters, something like that and more, just get $5 a month. But it adds up. You have a lot of little contributions, and it adds up, and you're able to like buy studio lighting and stuff, which I'm going to do really soon. Okay, so that's all there is to that. Okay, so our quiet participant, though he was on the show recently, our quiet contributor Black Horse, wondered if we might want to comment briefly on something going on in Canada. Now, obviously, there's been the whole trucker thing, but speaking sort of the economic side of it, you might have heard that the government of Canada, I'm not even sure if that's right, somebody in the regime started saying that they were going to seize people's bank accounts who were contributing to the efforts.
What I saw was that it was the government acting through a different party. So it couldn't be directly linked to the government, but it was, still the government perpetrating it, if I understood it correctly.
Right, yeah. It gets hard to tell at this point because they're obviously, as everyone knows by now, they're all in cahoots together, right? The big companies, the government, the NGOs, right? They all trade people back and forth. They're all of one mindset. And this is what we sometimes call the managerial elite. So anyway, somebody in the managerial elite indicated, and it was taken quite seriously, that they would start seizing people's bank accounts who had supported the Freedom Convoy, the truckers in Canada. Well, what do you know? When you do that, there's side effects, things you shouldn't be too surprised by, in fact. And Black Horse gives us some insight on that. So first of all, the state of emergency allows the state to arbitrarily seize assets. Trudeau, if you missed it, declared a state of emergency over the blockades and so forth of the truckers.
It might be worth mentioning that state of emergency he declared. It's not like bad weather hit in the States, under basically lockdown like you might get in the U.S. That state of emergency, the last time it was activated, there were like 200 terrorist attacks, kidnapping, and a bombing or something like that.
Right.
So it's war measures.
Right. And got some Fed posting in the super chat there. I'll have to figure out how to read that. Anyway, did you see it? Yeah, but we'll read that in a sec. Well, okay, I'll read it now. If peaceful protests work, Blood on the Blade says, Trudeau would have ended the mandates already. Revolutionary war for Canada is a must for freedom. Now, in the past, Canadians overthrowing their government would seem like a joke. But suddenly I'm not laughing anymore at the thought. It seems like, who knows what the Canadians could be capable of. Okay, so state of emergency allows the state to arbitrarily seize assets. This very unusual declaration of a state of emergency. And a lot of people, as Ryan indicated, think that it's pretty funky that he did this at all. It doesn't seem, it's like, what? It's an overreaction. And instead of making him look strong, like he's taking the making the appropriate response. It makes him look weak because he's, like, what is it? Killing the fly on the baby's head with a hammer, right? I mean, it's
and
way overboard.
not only that, but like the fly's been on the baby's head for like a good, long while now. Like you've had your opportunity to pick other things than the sledgehammer.
Right. Yeah. And he comes up with this heavy-handed measure. Yeah, I'm sorry, I never finished the sentence. So here's what Black Horse says. What is publicly known, the state of emergency allows the state to arbitrarily seize assets if you are even suspected of involvement with the protests. So really draconian measure here. So what do you think happened? People wanted to have cash and not things in bank accounts. Flight to cash, right? Flight to wire out money out of the country. Get it out of Canada, away from this awful government that might seize it, right? So there's cash shortages at ATMs and branches in some parts of the country. Now, that shouldn't have been a shock if you'd thought through it a little bit. When you credibly threaten to seize people's assets, they start to try to get those assets somewhere where you can't seize them. Surprise, surprise. Here's what I didn't know that Black Horse shared, which I thought was really worth sharing with everybody. The risk is that Canadian banks have a really good reputation for being a safe place to keep your assets. And they have traded on this business-wise. In Latin America, Scotiabank, for example, has one of the largest Latin America franchises in the world. Why? Because part of what they're offering is safety from arbitrary asset seizure, which is a problem in a banana republic, right? Not to pick on Latin America. Oh, here we go. Jimmy Thomas. I'll read them as they come. Jimmy Thomas says it was previously called the War Measures Act. It was invoked for World War I, World War II, and a separatist insurgency that kidnapped cabinet ministers. Okay, so 3 things that would be considered legitimately a war situation in all 3 cases. And now truckers. Yeah, now the trucker convoy. So yeah, thanks, Jimmy. Okay, so Scotiabank's got this business in Latin America where people in Latin America are like, I need to work with a foreign bank because I don't trust that the local banks will be safe from asset seizures by the, whichever regime comes in by coup tomorrow, right? So you can understand the situation of people in Latin America. Well, now they come along and do the Emergency Act, the War Measures Act it used to be called, right? And now your assets in Canada aren't safe. Hoping that those folks in Latin America didn't contribute to the trucker protest, right? We've got people in the bank industry in Canada really concerned about, I didn't know. This is what was interesting to me. We've heard of Swiss banks and like people parking money in Swiss banks because that's, that they're going to be safe, or at one time at least. I don't know if they're still viewed that way. You knew your assets would be safe in the Swiss bank. Well, I didn't know that Canadian banks were having this function, at least in Latin America. And now there's a cloud of doubt over how safe your assets are in a Canadian bank, right? So that's quite interesting. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Black Horse did think we ought to take credit, meaning Black Horse gets credit, for the analysis that he shared with us 2 weeks ago. That was right at the beginning. If you missed it, really recommend it. It's literally 30 minutes. I checked it. You have to, if you jump forward to when we start the show to when we finish that conversation, I believe it's 30 minutes, where Black Horse discusses the elites that are in play in regards to the trucker protest and his understanding of why one of those 3 key elites in Canada were backing the truckers and why they had already gotten what they wanted last week, I think. And so he thought they were going to back off and stop giving them support. And so what's going on, as would be predicted from that analysis, a crackdown. So multiple protests cleared by force, arrests made. Prior to that, that wasn't happening. It seemed like maybe the police and the military wouldn't cooperate because they were kind of tied in with that one elite that was backing the truckers. Anti-Kami says, glad to see you, Ryan. Hope all's well. If I had time, I'd try to continue the thoughts expressed on the Sniper stream with you, maybe in the future. Yeah, so you were on Sergeant Sniper's channel.
Yes, I was, and
Okay.
I kind of hinted at what I'll be talking about this weekend.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. I think that's it. Yeah, all we wanted to say on Canada. Anything else on Canada?
Yeah, there might be a good synthesis, but I say synthesis, not in the philosophical terms, but like there's a good extrapolation here that we could make. This is kind of indicative of the West becoming a banana republic style system where, you have these larger interests than what are nominally in the state that just control the state and will seize your money if you go against them, like a banana republic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean the idea was that a place like United States, a place like Canada, is different than that, fundamentally different, and crazy things like that won't happen. Which is a thing you could believe if you didn't know, like FDR seized everyone's gold, for example, a long time ago, right? Okay, so let's go to our main topic. All right, so we're going to do a historical topic. I love doing history, revisionist history in particular. The economic story of World War II in the United States, at least, that you'll find in the textbooks, and more than the textbooks, mainstream historians would tell you this story, is that there's the Depression, started in 1929 with the Black Friday market crash. It ground on through the 30s and just kept on going. But then World War II came along, and so the government had to spend a bunch of money, and that, the Keynesian view is that you can sort of jumpstart the economy by pumping money into it, right?
Right.
And so that got things going, and that actually during World War II, things were better. It essentially was a good time economically back home during World War II. And then, and this is the part of the story not everyone would know, but the mainstream conventional tale is that then, as you'd expect, when the government stops, goosing the economy with this spending, as the war winds down and government spending really drops precipitously, there'd be a recession. And they claim, in fact, that there was a recession for the first couple of years after the war.
Right. And
that's the orthodox telling.
And if you want to extend that further, not necessarily the war, but the government pumping money into things, they will tell you as well, FDR went really hard in the first year or so of the New Deal, and then backed off after that. And then what the orthodox history is that the economy slumped whenever the New Deal was sort of relaxed, quote unquote, because they didn't stop anything. They just didn't throw enough money, as much money as they did at the beginning. And they will say, well, look, the GDP fell, therefore the New Deal was good, and it was helping the economy. And then, so they rebound, and then, if I remember my numbers correctly, FDR and his cabinet basically just throw even more than they did in the first round into things, without necessarily doing like the scary sounding stuff, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and all that.
Right.
So, this goes beyond just World War II. It has its basis in the response to the Depression.
The analysis of the Depression. Right, that's very good. Sorry, I had a point or a question. Yeah, so that's interesting. So this thing of things go well when government spending. Oh yeah, GDP. Sorry, that reminded me. Yeah, here's the funny thing about a story that goes like this. The government spent more and GDP went up. It was a success. Well, that's sort of like, that's ridiculous because GDP includes government spending. So if the government spends more, the GDP goes up sort of by definition. So I'm not sure what you feel like you've proven when you go, look, line go up. Oh, by the way, part of the line is government spending, and the way we made it go up is the government spent more. Well, okay.
Right. And to recap, to make sure that we don't just sort of gloss over that, the argument from their perspective is GDP per capita is, a person's wealth. That's how well off someone is, which is the faulty assumption that we would dispute, but that's where their reasoning starts. Or real GDP per capita would be, I think, what they really started harping on now. Therefore, when the GDP goes up, GDP per capita goes up, living standards increase, therefore it's good, is what their reasoning is. Which means all you have to do is just throw money at something from the state, and now everyone's magically better off.
Right. Yeah. Right. Press F to doubt. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to cover this using an article by Robert Higgs. I have covered Robert Higgs on this show before. And in a way, I would say we're doing things out of order because the previous episode had to do with, it was a follow-up article, basically, where he introduced the notion of regime uncertainty. And I'll just summarize this really quickly. I don't know. I'm afraid to mess with anything because we were having problems broadcasting right before we went on air. Actually, we're fine.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah,
okay.
that's the same number.
Yeah. Anyway, if I can pull it up without messing things up, I will try to get that episode and put it in the live chat, the previous episode, because the two really go together. The two papers and our two discussions will fit together nicely. Anyway, in this other article that we're not covering today about regime uncertainty, he argues that part of the reason the Depression kept going is because businessmen under FDR had a reasonable fear. Try to remember that this was the 30s and, the Soviet Union was happening and, National Socialism and, centralization of economics was in vogue, fair to say, in the first half of the 20th century. Businessmen had a reasonable concern that FDR was literally just going to start seizing their businesses, nationalizing their businesses. Well, what do you do if you're afraid that your business is going to be nationalized? Well, you probably don't pour a lot of money into it.
Right.
Really extend yourself and really go like, okay, I'm putting all my chips in this system.
Not only that, but they had precedent from the First World War in the United States of businesses being nationalized for the war effort. So whenever the war kicks off in Europe, then things really get bad because people are like, well, we're probably going to get involved one way or another. Unless you're an idealist and you're like, by the grace of God, America will never set foot on foreign soil. Most people just assume somehow it's going to come to us. What happened in the last war for the businessmen? Well, the businessmen kind of just got subjugated by the government and turned into, basically the soft power version of a slave. They got conscripted into producing for the war effort and building for that, not at a market rate, so most of them then went under. That's what happened to the farmers after World War I. There was a giant boom in farming during World War I because the state was artificially supporting it and buying from it and all of that, while sort of soft nationalizing it with all the restrictions they had on it. And then when the war's over, the state just throws everything back out, if it even does, let the people take back over their businesses. It'll just throw everything back out, it'll crash, and then you're going to take a decade or so to recover.
Boy, I wish I could find that episode. I'll find it. Anyway, so that's the regime uncertainty story that Bob Higgs tells in a later article. But this is the earlier article where he starts by just questioning this whole narrative of the World War II ending the Great Depression. And it's weird, Ryan. I mean, you pay more attention to history. I keep having this thing where there's ideas in my head that got injected, but I don't remember how.
Yeah, that
you know
happens.
What I mean?
Yes.
Where I'm not remembering chapter and verse. Oh yeah, it was in that one textbook, and
right.
they literally made this claim. It's more like I almost wonder, just because of watching how our media functions, that it's more like they sort of imply something.
Yes.
Without putting themselves out there in such a way that you could just fact check them and go, well, no, that's not true. I mean, I looked up the numbers. It didn't work that way. They won't do that exactly. They'll just sort of leave you with the impression so that you walk away going, oh, yeah, World War II ended the Great Depression, right?
Right, yeah. In those textbooks, usually they don't even claim the New Deal, ended the Great Depression, like I was saying. They only say it helped it. Very few of the modern ones, I don't remember coming across, and then the Great Depression ended after World War II. They never make that claim explicitly.
When World War II started.
During the war ended the Depression. They don't explicitly usually make that claim, but they will then throw out a ton of things like, living standards increased, this amount of material was being produced, everyone was happier, and all this other stuff to make it seem like...
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So the implication is there, and you walk away because you learn normally, and you're like, oh, so it ended the Depression. The bad stuff is gone.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This is reminding me of how Academic Agent talks about how, when they're in power, Hollywood, the movies are all about how life is happy.
Yes.
And when they're not in power, it's about how life is grim and
Right.
stuff. Yeah. So during the Depression, even though FDR was in power, they are honest enough to say that it was a bad time.
Right.
Right. But then you go to World War II and suddenly they're telling you happy stuff, and you're like, oh, so I guess that sad stuff stopped
Well,
when the war started?
there's
or
something even more insidious here, and I don't
Yeah.
want to go too far off topic.
Well, I'm very interested in this whole issue of sort of the tricks that are played,
Yeah.
right?
So FDR was in power for the that first part, or not the first part, but his part of the Depression. But the conservative coalition led Congress, which was cross-party, but they opposed FDR on a lot of stuff. So they didn't have the full control that they would have come wartime. Which means when wartime comes, then they are fully in power, and oh, would you look at it, the media is suddenly happier, living standards are up, everyone's happy,
Yeah,
the nation's coming together now
I
that,
see.
now that there's no opposition internally.
Right. Okay. See if you can move this punch it just a little bit.
Left or right?
This towards me.
Okay.
Just to get you in frame a little better.
Right.
There we go. Okay. So let's turn to the article. Am I in the right place? Oop, here we go. Okay. Let's turn to the article and get rolling with this. Also, I would like to have the chat there, which I couldn't see. Okay. All right, so this is Robert Higgs' article, Wartime Prosperity, a Reassessment of the U.S. Economy in the 1940s from 1992, so that's 30 years ago. And I think what's really key, it's obviously I've made it the headline because that's what most people think about is the Depression and the relationship between the Depression and the war, and did the Depression end at that point? But a key part of what Bob does here is he deals with the mainstream story of the couple years after the war, because that's really it's part of the narrative, right? And so he undermines them sort of on 2 points in this paper. He undermines their narrative about the war, and he undermines their narrative about the couple years after the war. And it's really key to get both right, to get this story right. Okay, so he starts with a quote from Ludwig von Mises. War prosperity is like the prosperity that an earthquake or a plague brings, right? Meaning, an earthquake brings prosperity in the sense that now suddenly you've got to rebuild a bunch of stuff that got destroyed. It's
a really, really high or large scale broken window fallacy.
Exactly. That's an excellent way of putting it. Right. Big broken window fallacy. Okay, so now we've been hand waving a bit, but Robert Higgs, fortunately, is able, doing the paper, he's actually able to really nail this down and say they really do tell this story. So he says the 2 parts of the story here that they tell are encapsulated in the title of a chapter in a leading textbook, War Prosperity, the Keynesian Message Illustrated. So they are making a claim that there was prosperity during World War II, and furthermore that it in some sense supports the Keynesian view or something. Okay. And he says, I'm going to challenge this. So the accepted profile of the economy's performance during the 1940s, peak prosperity from 1943 to 1945, followed by much worse performance from 1946 to 49. So got it? U.S. gets in the war late 41. 41 basically doesn't count, right? Because it's right at the end of 41. So it's building up through 42. By 43, as we'll see, that represents a real peak in terms of war spending and stuff like that. It's really gotten up there. And then you're spending heavily. The U.S. government's spending heavily because of World War II, 1943, 44, 45. The accepted story here, the consensus view, is that that's a time of great economic performance. Then post-war, immediately the government spending, as we'll see in some charts, the government spending drops like really quick.
Yeah.
They really drop back.
Back when war measures were just for the war and not...
Yeah, right, and didn't just keep going
20
forever.
years.
Yeah. Right, so they really drew back their spending in a genuine way. I'm not joking. I mean, you'll see in the numbers. By 46, 47, the government's spending a heck of a lot less than it was during the war years. And in the consensus view, this results in bad economic performance in those post-war, several years after the war. Okay, so that profile, that consensus view, Bob Higgs says, is indefensible as a description of economic well-being. Historians and economists have failed to appreciate that the wartime economy, a command economy, cannot be readily compared with either the pre-war or the post-war economy. Okay, now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit with measures of, GDP and GNP and all this sort of stuff. But understand what he's saying here. He's saying that there are macroeconomic numbers that the government puts out. And he says you can't just unreflectively take those numbers and ignore the fact that some of those numbers came when much of the economy was being directed by Washington, D.C.
Right.
And some of those numbers came when it was back to something more like a free market, or closer, a lot closer to a free market. He says these numbers are not just, what does he say? He's saying they're not bringing context. They're just taking these numbers and just saying, well, look, there's the story, right? And he's like, you're going to have to be a little more nuanced than that, or you're going to end up with a bad story, which they have in this case.
And just to illustrate like how intensive those wartime measures were, like this is New Deal era, and the Truman era being called free market in comparison to the wartime command economy.
Right. Yeah. The war. I learned some things rereading this article to prepare for this. I was sort of stunned. I have to say, one of the things as someone who focuses on mass death, I'm ashamed to say I had no idea how many American soldiers died in World War II. I was stunned by the number. It blew my mind.
Yeah.
I did not understand. I mean, this was really. Understood that Russians died an even worse, on a whole nother level.
Right.
But still, the war deaths really blew my mind, and we'll get to them. Okay, so spelling out the consensus then. So according to the Orthodox account, the war got the economy out of the Depression. And here's the evidence they would cite for this. A great decline in the standard measure of the unemployment rate. Right? Because as you may recall, during the long depression, it varied, but it sometimes was as high as 25% unemployment. But it stayed in the 2-digit range, if I remember correctly,
yes,
throughout that period. It wouldn't always be at 25%, it'd be like 15% sometimes, but it was terrible.
That's why all of your photographs have people saying wants work or will work.
Yeah.
Or
Right. All the photos from that time, right? So that's one, great a decline in the unemployment rate. Second, a large increase in the standard measure of real GNP, and a slight increase in the standard measure of real personal consumption. Okay, so a really big shift down in unemployment, up in employment, a big shift up in GNP, and a slight shift in personal consumption. Okay, so this is taken to be an obvious validation of the simple Keynesian model. Now, I have to be careful because our old friend Lord Keynes, too, will come and say, well, that's not how I think. I know, he's a more sophisticated Keynesian, I suppose. But there's a simple Keynesian model that they try to use to tell this story, which is that enormous government spending with huge budget deficits spurred the military economy and produced multiplier effects on the civilian economy, right? So the government is spending money on building tanks and so on and so forth, and they're paying people to do that, and they're buying steel, and that's causing the civilian economy to have money to spend and so forth. So it's a multiplier effect throughout the economy, right? And so what's the upshot? Increased employment, increased real output, increased consumption, and decreased unemployment, right? Okay, and he says he's not just making this up. This consensus account, with maybe minor qualifications, appears in the works of historians, economists, and other writers. Now, you actually look at some of the mainstream history, I assume. You don't only read revisionist history.
No, I don't, unfortunately.
So you would agree that you will see this story for real.
Yeah, so whenever you get whenever you get to the Great Society and all of that era in U.S. economic history, where they just start throwing money basically out the window for fun, their justification is, well, in World War II, we were deficit spending, and everything was great.
Yeah.
So if we just do it during peacetime, where people aren't, well, peacetime because there was Vietnam, but it wasn't
right.
great.
It wasn't the World War II.
Yeah. If we do this during relative peacetime, then everything will be even better because people aren't dying, and the money is the deficit spending is going to have its normal effect.
Right.
So
guns and butter.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So your point is not only is Higgs not lying here, that consensus account really is out there.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but they'll invoke it to justify
Yes.
repeating the behavior.
Because before now, or before here, it was considered almost scandalous in some places to deficit spend during the Great Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Because all the other depressions that we had up until that point, bar like the World War I related stuff during the war, everything was just solved by we're balancing the budget.
Yeah,
and
tighten the belt on the government, on the state.
Right. Yes. Right. So this is being done during World War II, and they kind of lump in the New Deal as well. Like we built up, and then we had this great boom during World War II, and then you get to the '60s, no gigantic war going on, no like crisis really, other than like a manufactured one in the civil rights movement. But that, as we see, that was under control the whole time.
Right.
What you get is there for the first time people are like, yeah, we can deficit spend.
Yeah.
It's not scandalous. People are like, it did all these great things for the poor people in the rural areas, and everything was booming. The whole country came together.
Right. So I shared that I was going to do this with Academic Agent and some of our other friends on YouTube, and I said it's a minor strike at the Boomer Truth regime. But to be fair, from a point of view of economics, as you're pointing out, this is really fundamental, and it's really a paradigm shift.
Yes.
And regular folks, like my grandparents who lived through the Depression, World War II, would be like, yeah, FDR saved us from the Depression, and they would repeat this story, and that would mean then that they would, at the voting booth, they would support a Great Society type of thing, right? It had a real effect, is my point.
That's most of the population. My great-grandparents were farmers, and they did not take well to the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So they didn't take too terribly well to LBJ. They liked Kennedy for some reason, but they didn't, which we'll get another time. But so there are segments of the population didn't fare well under this stuff. Very, very small minority groups that do oppose this, and it is seen as scandalous. But it's not like going into the 20s or the 30s or the 40s, where or basically the 30s at that point, because that's when the real scandal hit, we're deficit spending the whole way through. At that point in time in American politics, you still have the leftovers from basically the classical liberal wing of the Democratic Party, which becomes part of the conservative coalition, its progeny anyways.
Right.
And you also have sort of the classic...
Southern Democrats, maybe?
Kind of, but there were a lot of Midwestern and Northern ones as well.
Okay.
And then you also have sort of like the classical Republicans as well that weren't the ultra-liberals or the interventionists. They were kind of like the northern businessmen types. Mm-hmm. Also didn't take well to deficit spending. Mm-hmm. Get to the 60s, most of them have died off. FDR did a lot of bureaucratic work, so he replaced, anyone that got a position to start off with basically got it from FDR or one of his appointees. By the time you get to the 60s, it's all him. Like that, it's all the stuff that he left over. Because he had, 4 presidential terms. Truman.
It makes me think of AA, right, with talking about how Blair came in and just passed a gazillion laws and replaced personnel.
And it's like,
and Blair's out, but you still have Blair's apparatus. Right.
So,
and you're saying basically by the 60s, you not only have FDR's apparatus, but you have everybody believing these stories.
Well, so you have both of those. And the thing that saves us here is that unlike in the UK with Tony Blair, we actually had, at this point, parts of the government that did not want to move along with FDR. Doesn't mean that they were, the full-based, ultra-right-wingers that people idealize, but they didn't go fully along with FDR. Mm-hmm. There was resistance. They just did not, they didn't appoint people, give people jobs. They didn't control the executive branch for however long. They lost.
And then they were out.
Yeah.
Or died.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so funny thing, by the way, about our chairs, I didn't think about it, is that Ryan actually is taller than me, but he looks shorter. Yeah, sit up, sit up.
Yeah.
There we go. Give him some kind of idea. It's just the way our chairs are. He's actually a tall guy. Okay, so let's start taking this apart one piece at a time. First is the employment. And he doesn't completely, he doesn't talk about it here as much, but near the end he says, yeah, I can understand, people who were having trouble getting work, and now, through unfortunate circumstances, they now have a job.
Right.
It might be as a soldier, and they might be in danger,
Right.
or they might be at a factory or whatever. But you could see how people sort of view that positively. It feels a little more even if it's artificial. At least it introduces some certainty in your life.
Right. And we also still had a military tradition at this point. Like the military was viewed as a favorable occupation to a lot of society. Not anymore necessarily, but
right. Okay, so having said that, let's see the obvious trick that gets played here, right? Which is that he says, okay, so the standard measure of the unemployment rate fell between 1940 and 1944 from 14% to 1%. Okay, so it went from that depression level 2-digit unemployment rate down to 1.2%. I think is considered about as low as you go because people change jobs and stuff, right? So,
and anything more than that, I don't know which schools will necessarily say this, but it's in the history or the standard narrative is anything lower than that, you're causing a labor shortage, and then prices go up, and
a lower unemployment rate. Yeah, you don't really want to go much lower than like 1%.
From the central planner's perspective.
Yeah, right. Okay. Okay, so this measure signals a virtual disappearance of unemployment during the war, but in the circumstances, this measure does not mean what it is taken to mean. So he's about to make the obvious point that I hope you see coming, which is, sure, you can get rid of unemployment if you just draft everybody into a war, right? Okay, but it's actually a little more interesting than that. Listen to this. So the buildup of the armed forces to more than 12 million persons by 1945 made an enormous decline of the unemployment rate inevitable. And here's this caught my eye, and I shared it with AA, because he's been talking about how the Allies could not really get people to fight yet another stupid European war voluntarily, and they had to use conscription. Right. So he actually makes that point here, which I thought was really nice that he slipped in some numbers on this. Of the 16 million persons who served in the armed forces at some time during World War II, 10 million were conscripted, and many of those who volunteered did so only to avoid the draft and the consequent likelihood of assignment to the infantry. Anyone who's familiar with Vietnam draft understands what he's talking about here, right? People would volunteer because they figured if their draft came up, they'd be a Marine grunt or something.
Yeah, you're going to get shot.
right. Yeah, but if you volunteered, you could maybe put yourself into a better position in the military. So massive shift of people into the military, a lot of it forcefully through draft or the threat of draft, right?
Right.
Okay.
Isn't that basically the communist solution to unemployment, right?
Right, yeah. So the 12 million serving in the armed forces during the last year of the war, most of them under duress, constituted about 18% of the total labor force, civilian plus military. So this was big, 18% of the labor force. Boom, right? Okay, so what happened is no mystery then. During the war, the government pulled the equivalent of 22% of the pre-war labor force into the armed forces. Voila, the unemployment rate dropped to a very low level. So this is not a complicated story. There was a lot of people not working because the economy continued to be screwed up due to FDR. And so they just made them work, often as actual soldiers or in support.
Right.
Building things and so on and so forth. So whether the government ran deficits or not, whether the money stock increased or not, massive military conscription was sure to decrease dramatically the rate of employment. So what is his point here? Don't miss what he's doing here. He's saying, drawing a conclusion about the success of Keynesian economic measures from the fact that they drafted everybody into a war does not add up. He's like, whatever they were going to do with their spending plans and stuff like that, you just make people be employed.
Right. And
then you get rid of unemployment. I mean, that doesn't say anything about wartime economic planning or anything.
Or well-being, which is why you care about these things to begin with.
Right.
Like, if this wasn't attached to humans, would not matter, right? Everything from the Austrian perspective is built from the human up,
right.
Interactions included. Keynesians just view it as a statistic.
Yeah, right.
So
they want to make line go up. That's why we joke about line go up, because there's people who really think that way.
Right, yeah, but even more gruesome than that, like, it's not just line go up. To them, you are a statistic. If they even consider you in the first place. Like, it's just a number. Right. So, whenever they see these, like, I would be willing to bet some of them wouldn't even have they wouldn't see the issue with what we're saying, because we inherently think back to the person. Like,
right.
They don't.
And they're trying to twist dials on the economy. That's how I've always pictured it. This dial is unemployment rate. This dial is inflation rate. Right. So they just twiddle these dials.
We made unemployment go down. What's the issue? Is what they would say.
Right. Okay, so I like how he drives this point home, though. He says between 1940 and 1944, unemployment fell by either 7 million or 4 million, depending on which measure you use. The official one was 7.5 million, while the armed forces increased by almost 11 million. Even if one views eliminating civilian unemployment as tantamount to producing prosperity, one must recognize that placing, I'll use the higher number, placing 235 persons in the armed forces to gain a reduction of 100 persons in civilian unemployment was a grotesque way to achieve prosperity, even if a job were a job. That is, even if we don't realize that people are actually like being put in danger by being drafted in the military. We just treat it as a job. This is sort of strange, right? You do all this drafting of people, and then you don't even get a 1-for-1.
Yeah, you'd want a better ratio, presumably.
Yeah, right. Okay, and this is something I'm going to emphasize this weekend from Robert Higgs. He always has a keen sense of justice, and it's something we can learn from him. He brings home the human element here. Military jobs, of course, were not just a job. They differed categorically. They entailed substantial risks of death, dismemberment, and other physical and psychological injuries. Military service yielded little pay under harsh conditions, and like it or not, lasted for the duration of the war. Sustained involvement in combat drove many men insane. Physical casualties included 405,399 dead and 670,846 wounded. I literally didn't know how big the numbers were. Yeah. I don't know how I missed this, because I think I tended to be, just because of my own research and stuff, I tended to be looking at like Russian and German casualties and stuff. Yeah, I had no idea how. The numbers are way above this. I'm not taking anything away from the suffering of those people.
That's just why. Yeah.
But the American casualties are horrendous. Yeah. This is huge.
That number dead.
500,000 people dead nearly.
Well, yeah, that 400,000 dead is just 200,000 off the Civil War, and we've covered how gruesome that was.
Yeah, which was horrendous. Yeah. Wow. So anyway, okay, so he drives that point home. All right. Now, I'm going to skip some of this because he's just getting into the details. Nothing else I wanted to highlight. Okay, so why didn't I highlight more here? Okay, next he talked about real. So that's the unemployment story, and he says, very simply, this doesn't tell us anything about increasing people's well-being, about the efficacy of wartime spending or anything like that. Simply, you just made people have a job by drafting them to the military. Okay, all right. So then, real output. And here he kind of gets in the weeds a little bit of the different statistical measures and the official measures, and then a fellow named Simon Kuznets, who is sort of the big name in this sort of statistical analysis of these government numbers. And anyway, what it comes out to is that if you take the, it's going to be hard to see this here, but let's see, let's go with the 1990 estimate. So this is showing the gross national product And so gross domestic product is the one that you really have to watch for, because there they just unthinkingly toss in government spending. Gross national product is meant to be a little better than that, but it kind of depends on who's doing it. In this case, let's see, commerce would be, yeah, U.S. U.S. Sorry. What does he mean by commerce? I think he means that's the official. That's the Department of Commerce, right? Something like that. And this is the story that the consensus story tells, which is that you see that GNP moving up. It's they baseline it in 1939 at 100. It's going up, by the way. So maybe, without the war, maybe it would have been the Depression starting to come out of there. It goes up a bit in 1940, but then 1941, and then particularly 42, 43, 44, it really jumps, so that baselining at 1939 is 100. By 1944, it's 172 gross national product. This is index numbers, not dollars or anything. Okay, but and then so that's the wartime story, right? Look, GNP line go up during the war. Then we hit 45, still very high, 169 instead of 172, coming out of the war there in 45, but still up there with the wartime spending. And then it drops in the subsequent years, 149, 148, 154. So it comes down, and so they view this as like, the economy doesn't do as well after that.
We stopped producing guns, therefore everyone's worse off.
Right, exactly.
Or
then,
tanks is a better...
The final column is, I'm not going to go into all the explanation of it, but here it's, let's see, gets rid of gross war construction, durable munitions. Anyway, it tries to take out the things that aren't really benefiting consumers. And so here you see a different story. Again, numbers going up through 40, even into 41. Remember, the war doesn't really start until the end of 41. And then it goes down in 42, 43, 44. Stays pretty low in 45, and then really jumps in 46, 47, 48, 49. That final column is the story that Higgs thinks is accurate. If you look at it from what economists are supposed to be measuring, which is like consumer well-being, best we can do with these macroeconomic measures, right? Consumer well-being went down during the war, and the post-war years were actually very good economically. Yeah, it was a huge recovery.
45 to 46 is a bigger jump in the GNP than with your estimates over here over on the left side of the columns, where we were saying at the start of the war it just suddenly jumps 42 to 43.
Right.
It's actually a bigger one, 45 to 46 in the GNP.
Right.
Which
yeah. Oh, no.
Unbelievable to me.
Right. So the story that Robert Higgs tells is that 1946 was the true end of the Great Depression. That is, we should speak of the Great Depression as having gone on for a horrendous, sorry, my brain just went blank, 17 years? Did I get it right? 29 to 46? 16, 17 years,
yeah.
Right? Which is just nuts. Okay, so what do I want to highlight here? Right, so, just repeating what I said. So whereas the Commerce Department's latest estimate of real GNP drops precipitously in 1946 and remains at that low level for the rest of the decade, Kuznets' estimate increases in 1946 by about 8% and rises slightly higher during the next 3 years. And then he argues that you could go even further and delete all war outlays, because he talks about, does war spending purchase a final good and hence belong in GNP, or an intermediate good and hence not belong? So it becomes almost a philosophical discussion.
Right.
Is a tank a final good, right? From the point of view of the consumer, it really isn't, right?
Right.
We don't go out and buy tanks. we presumably want to be safe. This is assuming, of course, that World War II had anything to do with keeping Americans safe, which I don't agree with.
In a better world, we could just go out and buy a tank, though.
Well, right, yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay, and then I'll say it one more time. The better estimate of GNP reaches a peak in 41, stalls throughout the war period, then surges with the demobilization and reconversion. jumped by nearly, this is what you were calling out, nearly 17% between 45 and 46, remained at that higher level for the rest of the decade. No wartime prosperity when we correct the measures here.
And if you jump back to one of our other shows about inflation, or war hiding inflation, one of the things that we cover is that in war, you can't really produce new things with the command economy. You can just take what you already have. That was one of the things that we covered, I believe, where we were discussing the merchant with like copper that was producing things for the government, and he kept the money kept inflating. But I remember discussing on that stream, it's really hard to actually invest really in capital for the future. You just have to take what you have with the government, use all the resources, and you don't really grow much. You don't invest much. That's what this makes sense here, because during that whole war period where the state just nationalizes or soft nationalizes everything, nothing grows. No one's investing in anything new. No one's planning for the future. You're just trying to get through now, and they're taking everything that you already have in being. So you can't use that to make new things for the future.
Right. Okay. Well, he's actually gonna. I hope I highlighted it. He actually covers that there was indeed degradation of plant.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a real issue during the war. Okay. So. Right. So when one adopts this position on the treatment of military outlays, that is, when one deducts all of them from GNP on the grounds that they purchase at best intermediate rather than final goods, one arrives at a starkly different understanding of economic performance in the 1940s. And it's a little tricky because what do they mean when they say the economy was doing great in the 40s? I mean, I think especially when they link it to the ending of the Great Depression, the idea is that for regular people even, not people who were concerned with war spending or building the military machine, regular people were like better off.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Yeah, and that's the story that Higgs is trying to undermine here, and he's saying no, they weren't.
And you could bypass this narrative if you just ask anyone that was a civilian at the time. How was the 40s compared to the 30s? If earlier before they reached the old age that they're at now, most of them will probably say wasn't really that good until later.
Right. Yeah.
Some of them might say the 50s if they were in a certain industry.
Right.
So usually they'll say the 60s in terms of material, things like that.
Right.
Never the 40s.
And he points out you can get pretty extreme here. Lundberg said, go full Rothbard and deduct the war spending. Anyway, Higgs makes a really good point. Outside of a more or less competitive equilibrium framework, the use of prices as weights in an aggregation of physical quantities loses its theoretical justification. That is that no meaningful estimate of real national product is possible. What he's saying there is the United States, to a great degree, became a command economy for the duration of the war. So prices were not... you have to understand, when we talk about a price, I asked a lawyer once, so what is a price? And he says, willing buyer, willing seller. That it just came out of him like he was reading out of a textbook.
Right.
And anyway, and I used it against him. But anyway, but that's correct, right? A market price comes from a willing exchange on both sides.
Right.
And that price is the thing that we feel is so important, directs the economy to invest in the right places and so forth, right? The price, in the sense that a command economy gives it, is just a number they make up. It does not have that rich information that aggregating all kinds of people's decisions, voluntary decisions, to understand that we do need more nails and we do need more hammers or whatever.
Or this is how much people want this.
Right. That's where prices. That's why economists lay such emphasis on market prices, is that they are really information rich and they direct the economy to do things that make sense.
A good resource on this.
And address scarcity.
Yeah.
But a command economy price should always be in scare quotes.
Right.
It is not a market price. It's a number they made up, just like the Soviet planners would sit down and say, how much will we pay the factory for the nails we
It's a fee.
told them to, yeah, it's like a fee. Right? Anyway, go ahead.
And this is basically, economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. That's the entire article for further reading. But whenever you start putting price controls down, and this doesn't even have to be in wartime, whenever you start saying you can't go beyond this or you can't fall below this, your minimum wage or your gasoline price controls, depending on the time period, what you're saying there is like, you're not allowed to say this is how much you want this, or you're not allowed to say this is how much of this we've got.
Yeah.
Because they've just turned the price into something else. It's now a punitive fee, basically.
Right.
And that's how they view it. That's why they try to control it.
Right.
They view it as punitive rather than something that comes about organically.
And that helps guide us towards rational action. Yeah.
Yes. Like if we just randomly say this costs $100 randomly, they can try to justify it, but it's not a price. They can just say this costs $100. That's not telling us this is how much there is or this is how much we want it. You just said this costs $100. How do we plan around that?
Right.
Who knows?
Right. So driving home the point, Higgs says, in fact, price was never a factor in the allocation of resources for war purposes. The authorities did not permit the price-cost relationship to determine either the level of output or the distribution of the final product to individual uses. So the government had displaced the price system. And so comparisons of the war and pre-war economies, even comparisons between successive years, had become highly dubious. That is, 1941 prices, which was essentially a non-war year, because it was right at the end, right?
Yeah, December.
Yeah, December. So 1941 prices and 1942 prices were from different universes.
Right.
Right. They're not comparable.
For the ones that weren't New Dealed.
Yeah, well, right. Some of them were already command economy prices. Yeah, so, how much do we trust these prices anyway? By the way, there's an implicit thing here that some people may be thinking, or maybe it's just so buried in us with the, the boomer truth regime we all have grown up in, which is that, well, of course, they didn't consider price a factor in the allocation. It had to be to mobilize for this big war effort. They had to control the prices and turn it into a command economy. How else would you do it? Hold that thought. We're going to finish this article, and before we finish the show, we're going to address that thought. Yeah, you like that part. Okay. So so coming back to how artificial the situation was, he points out that much output during the war, especially the weapons, consisted of goods that did not exist before the war. So, how do you compare the economy of 1943 to the economy of 1941? They're not even making the same things. And the prices are fake, right?
Right.
Also, he says production of many important consumer goods was outlawed. Now, I don't know the details of this. I know that there were, rationing type stuff. But I didn't know that any consumer goods were just straight out outlawed.
Yeah.
You know what he's talking about?
So there were a lot of luxury goods where you just couldn't import them, not allowed.
Okay, and you couldn't make them either?
Well, I mean, get a South African diamond from the Midwest. But
that's right. Sure.
Their radios and telephones, they might have outlawed civilian consumption of that because you needed those for the front lines. And
so
for
all the resources that would go into making those things were considered too precious to be used by regular people.
Right.
They were only for military use.
Right, and also if you watch the 50s cartoons or movies or something like that, any toys that they have left over from the 40s, very few of them, and they're all wood carved. Very little metal. Very little moving parts,
right,
and things along those lines. You don't really have them,
right? Because again, as we remember, they're having these drives for rubber and for metal.
Yeah, send in your extra silverware so that we can make an extra gun. That was where they were. Or that's where they said they were, anyways, to get all these consumer goods.
Right.
Certain inputs were just outright banned. So you mentioned rubber.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the important ones. Aluminum. Aluminum was valuable for war effort.
Banned from use for civilian purposes.
Right, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
They wanted it all totally for the war effort.
Yeah. You had to aluminum was hard to come by. So was tungsten. Anything that used tungsten.
Mm-hmm.
So also there were a lot of like
Key inputs for war
Yeah.
material production.
And then look at like civilian car manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
All like 41 to 45. There's quite a few brands where it's hard to find something between those years. Like, and then some car aficionado is gonna be like, oh well, actually it's really common. But you know, look at what they were doing in the 50s, the 60s, and compare that to the 40s and the 30s, and then compare that to the 20s. You know, the great car manufacturer.
Yeah, right.
You know, civilian. It not only was it looked down upon due to media browbeating. You know, you bought a consumer car. What a unpatriotic loser.
Yeah.
But also like the government was taking everything. Supply was scarce, and they were banning things for input. And then you also had this like demand had completely fallen.
Right.
So supply's down, demand's down. Not much is being produced. Also, if I remember correctly,
Things are
prices
outlawed.
Yeah, prices also went up. So those are a few examples.
Right. So that reminds me a bit about the car. Unpatriotic if you're driving a car. So Lou Rockwell, as you may or may not know, but will hopefully in a month when we're at the Mises Institute, hopefully, together, you will see his collection of World War II propaganda posters. The upper floor of the Mises Institute, near where his office is just they're in the bathroom. They're just all over. They're all up there. It's really, you don't want to miss that. He's got a really nice collection. And one of the ones that always struck me, we almost used it for the thumbnail, but we ended up using something else, is the one that says, if you drive alone, you drive with Hitler.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's literally got like a sort of a ghost Hitler in the passenger seat.
Yeah. And
right.
So and you know, your government's doing this today as well. If they screw up, you know, gasoline or oil, and they'll say, oh, well, then you should just carpool.
Right,
like,
yeah.
We're not going to fix the problem. We're just going to bandage over it. And this is what they were doing in the war. They started the war. You know, people can't really be driving alone now because these things are artificially scarce for the artificial, you know, war that they've created here. And now, just carpool. That'll fix it.
Yeah. Okay, so final point, summarizing what we're getting at about the prices. He writes, in a command economy, the fundamental accounting difficulty is that the authorities suppress and replace the only genuinely meaningful manifestations of people's valuations, namely free market prices. So, you know, he's saying if we trust the numbers, adjust them, as he explained, we can show that this story of wartime prosperity is ridiculous. But we shouldn't even trust the numbers.
Right.
Because it's all just fake.
Right.
During the war because of the widespread central planning.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And then remember there were three pillars to the case that he's taking apart one by one. One was that unemployment dropped during the war. Two is that the GNP line went up.
Yeah, real output
went up. And then third was a minor point in the consensus narrative, the orthodox story, which is that there was a little bit of a rise in real consumption.
Right. The only point where they might say, oh, so people were actually, you know, better off. They were consuming more.
Right.
Tenuous, but
yeah, well,
closer than the other two.
I think he's going to destroy it. So most writers insist that real personal consumption increased during the war. In Seymour Melman's flamboyant but otherwise representative portrayal, the economy was producing more guns and more butter. Americans had never had it so good.
Guns and butter. What more do you need in your life?
They had never had it so good. Okay, he says, this belief rests on a weak foundation. Robert Higgs is a careful scholar, so he's a master of understatement.
Yeah.
Anyway, it fails to take sufficiently into account the understatement of actual wartime inflation by the official price indexes. Okay, so understating inflation. The deterioration of quality and disappearance from the market of many consumer goods.
Right. So not only
choices on the shelves were worse and scarce.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Not only were they like limiting what you could produce and, you know, what you could put in that production, they were all everything was, you know, so artificially expensive. You can't afford to make it at that long-lasting 1920s, 1910 quality.
Right. Exactly, yeah. Third, the full effect of the non-price rationing of many widely consumed items hopefully most people know that there was rationing, well, all over the place. It wasn't just
Yeah.
the United States. I think England, they had their ration books or
Yeah, and quite famously because
Yeah.
they had U-boats to deal with.
Yeah, right. Let's see. And the additional transaction costs borne and other sacrifices made by consumers to get the goods that were available. That is one that I think about a lot because these last 2 years, right? So I'm
Right.
outfitting, as Ryan has gotten to meet, I'm outfitting a total of 10 of us, counting myself,
Yes.
at this house. And when I go to the store and they say, you're allowed to buy 4 rolls of toilet paper, I'm like, okay, I've got 10 people at my
Yeah.
house. Okay.
Yeah.
And now maybe, I forget it. I think I did end up doing this with toilet paper. Now maybe I'm running to another store
And
to like get more toilet paper,
Right.
or even find a store that has toilet paper. That actually was happening
right, yeah.
early on
Really early
in
on,
2021.
You remember seeing all the pictures of
Or,
people
well, I'm sorry, we're in 2022. 2020, I'm
Yeah.
saying.
You ever seeing all the pictures of people like laughing at like, ha, look at them running on the stores for toilet paper, and then like 2 weeks later, stores are like,
Yeah. We have no toilet
yeah,
paper.
we're not going to be able to get more of this.
Right. Yeah. So I can connect to what he's saying in this final point, which is it starts to become a real burden when, the thing we're just used to, we take it for granted. We go to the store and the thing we need to buy is on the shelf.
Right.
And we can get as much as we need of it, right? Well, at times like 2020, but more importantly, during World War II, that isn't true anymore. And now you're running around, you're making deals. You're like, hey, you work at the store, right? Could you set one aside for me, right? And your life becomes more complicated. And
Well, that last example you just mentioned is just a communist country. Hey,
Yeah.
set this aside for me.
right,
I need
exactly.
it.
That's like how they function
Right, yeah.
in that situation.
Um,
Okay, so here's again the numbers. The Commerce Department numbers show real personal consumption. It doesn't tell a dramatic story, but as we get into the war, it slightly goes up so that relative to, say, 1941, it's actually higher by 1944 and 1945. And he says these figures have led historians and economists to conclude that the well-being of consumers improved, though not by much, during the war. And this whole thing of we've never had it so good. I mean, I think even a careful Orthodox historian would be like,
Yeah. And
that's a little much,
and like look at what he meant that in terms of material.
Right.
But like any good historian would say like, well, there were times where you owned your land. Like that was just expected.
Right.
Like, that can be a good thing depending on the perspective.
Yeah. And so he says there's a couple problems with this. First, the population was growing. And so if you take that into account, that means that those goods are being spread among a wider population. And so that implies that real personal consumption per capita remained essentially unchanged between 41 and 44. So he says, merely to maintain the level of 1941, a year in which the economy had yet to recover fully from the Depression, hardly signifies wartime prosperity, right? But the more serious problem is that these standard numbers are fatally flawed by their deflators. They underestimate the actual inflation during the war. And an important point usually overlooked, they overstate the actual inflation during the immediate post-war period. Because remember, the Keynesian story, we're going to focus on the Depression ended. But the Keynesian story has to do both parts. They have to say that during the war, things were great. And after the war, when the government stopped spending so much, we had trouble. So both sides get distorted.
Yeah, funnily enough, I know a regime, and not pointing any fingers, that understates inflation and,
Yeah.
suddenly coming out with it after the fact of the, the major actions.
Right.
I've seen this before.
Yep. Yeah, I had just suggested to AA a couple days yesterday, maybe, that they are not very innovative.
No.
They just kind of keep doing the same things over and over.
Yeah. I mean, false flags, Spanish-American War, understated inflation, all the world wars.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are their two big playbooks.
Okay, now this might surprise you because this tends to be an Austrian channel, but that doesn't mean we pay no attention to non-Austrian economists. And in particular, Robert Higgs, I really knew him at the time that he was transitioning both to just outright saying, I am an Austrian economist. I am part of the Austrian school. Because he didn't necessarily see himself that way for much of his career. But he was kept trending more and more in that direction. Right. And let's be clear, his key work was reviewed by Rothbard, and Rothbard liked it. You know, so he was a friend all along. He was a fellow traveler or something. But he outright, over the years I knew him and interacted with him at the Mises Institute, he just outright said, I'm an Austrian economist. And I very excitedly went up to Lou and I said, yeah, Bob says he's really an Austrian economist now. And Lou said, even better, he's an anarchist. Because that was another transition he went through at that time. Anyway, so all that to say that here he cites Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who, if you don't know about economics, you might not know that they wrote a big old book, and I'm not going to get the title right, but they wrote a big old book about the
Great Depression.
Well, that's true, but financial history of the United States. Or something. There's a big old encyclopedia style book where lots of numbers.
Milton Friedman either produces basic college lectures about here's libertarianism.
Yeah, why the minimum wage is bad and stuff.
Or he goes full into here's everything that happened financially that's relevant between 1910 and 1950.
Exactly. Yeah. So he actually says the most credible alternative deflator from the official one was produced by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. And they thought that the official adjustment for inflation was really understated. So let's see if I can get my story right here. Yeah, when we use Friedman and Schwartz's deflator, what do we see with real personal consumption per capita? I'll just read off some of these numbers a little bit. So from 1939 to 1941, remember 41 is not a war year. I mean, I don't think you can count as a war year when it's like the last few days of the war. Yeah, less than a month. So 1939 to 1941, index, by the way, not number, not dollars. Well, okay. Anyway, let's call it $100. So $100 in 1939 is your real personal consumption per person, per capita, right? In 1940, it goes to 104, 1941, 108. Still depression levels, but going in the right direction. 42 now we get into the war years, it drops back to 104, then drops again to 101, then 44, it's 102, 45, it's 106. So basically, it sputters along below that 1941 year. Again, as Higgs emphasizes here, 41 was not like a signal year for the American economy. It was still a depression year. The depression was still going since 1929, all through those years. It's kind of horrible. I'm like, no wonder my grandparents talked about it so much. And my maternal grandparents just had like all kinds of like soap. And they just had like, they were ready for the apocalypse. Yeah. Like their whole life.
Yeah. You know? Never again.
Yeah. They were always ready for things to go down, you know. So when you adjust properly for inflation, wartime inflation, which you can imagine with the war bonds and all this stuff, it was a mess, inflation, then you see that real personal consumption goes down during the war, basically. What happens after the war? So 1946, remember 1945, the war ends, you would know the dates, but it's like May and July or something, right?
It would close, yeah.
What is it? May, and then VE Day, and then VJ Day is... you don't...
I don't know dates, and we talked history all these times, and every single time I'm like, I'm not going to remember the dates off the top of my head.
Anyway, it's by the latter half of 45, you're out of the war.
Yes.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Roughly latter half. 46 then is a fully post-war year. And so then it goes to $126 per capita, per person in real consumption. So it really jumps from 45 to 46. And this is where we can see why 46 is considered by Higgs, and I think probably by the people who were actually there. They are really feeling that the depression is finally over. Right. And then it stays at these levels and, in fact, goes up through 47, 48, 49. So he says conditions were much worse than the data suggests for consumers during the war. Millions of people had to move, many of them long distances to centers of war production. I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because you had
You
people
couldn't
moving all
you couldn't stay in your little small Missouri town
right. Yeah.
because no one was making guns there
Right.
or whatever.
During the Depression before the war, you had a large number of Oklahomans moving famously to California.
Right.
And then during the war, you had Oklahomans just moving anywhere that there was a city because that's where the factories are.
Right.
So, not necessarily out of state, but you saw like sort of local culture just die.
Yeah. Drawn to the urban centers because that's where they built the plants.
Right. And
I'm sorry, that's where they had the plants already that got repurposed for the war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and like the town that I'm from, during the 20s and the early part of the 30s, it had like 3 theaters and like a whole ton of like other like just cultural stuff for the town. Come the 40s, everyone's gone. The theaters are closed down. They just barely saved one to preserve it. It destroyed local cohesion basically.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we probably neglect. I tend to lay emphasis in my thinking of what happened to the American town, right? I tend to lay emphasis on the Eisenhower National Defense Highway System and stuff like this, right? And other things that are done by the government. But yeah, what about the fact that World War II made a bunch of American towns into ghost towns?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That probably had some impact. Okay, so there's the migration costs. After bearing substantial costs of relocation, the migrants often found themselves crowded into poorer housing. There were rent controls. As we good economists know, even Chicago schools knows this, rent controls means that the housing gets worse each year because the landlords reduce or eliminate maintenance and repairs. They can't increase your rent.
I think that's even Keynesians that will admit that it's bad.
Yeah, I think everybody knows this. All economists know this. They can't increase your rent, and so they just give you less.
Right.
By the way, I meant to make this point before in terms of consumer goods, talked about them becoming less quality and stuff. One of the things you'll see if you watch really carefully, and I don't love anything, I don't love candy bars or anything, so I don't watch this so carefully, but one of the things you'll see is that the weight will be these funny numbers.
Right.
14 and a half ounces or something.
Shrinkflation.
And it's shrinkflation. They're charging the same, but they actually have like less chocolate in your Toblerone or whatever.
Or like a bag of chips or something. Like they'll go from like if you have a bag this full or this big, they would go from like it's this full of chips down to this full of chips.
I know. We just opened a bag of chips the other day, and one of my kids is like, "Dad, there's like no chips in this bag. What is this?"
I can't imagine it's gotten any better in the last few years for some reason.
Okay. No new cars were being produced. Okay, I wasn't sure about that, but you're saying basically they just ended civilian car production.
Basically, yeah.
You basically had to keep using the previous cars.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if it broke down, you better get it fixed, otherwise.
Right. No new cars were being produced. Used cars were hard to come by because of rationing and were sold on the black market at elevated prices.
Yep.
As we discussed, gasoline and tires were rationed. Public transportation was crowded and inconvenient for many, as well as frequently preempted by the military authorities. So you're trying to get to work and they're like, sorry, troops are on this.
Right.
Shoppers bore a substantial cost of searching for sellers willing to sell goods. We discussed this, including ration goods at controlled prices. They spent much valuable time arranging illegal trades of ration coupons or standing in queues. The government exhorted the public to use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. In thousands of ways, consumers lost their freedom of choice. And if you didn't see our thumbnail, I hope you take a glance. It's really good. Wonderful work by Andrew as usual. And it says on it, oh shoot, I already forgot. It's do it with less.
Yes.
Do it with less, right? Which was a nice summary of sort of what we just heard. Use it up, wear it out, and make it do or do without. Okay, so people were working harder, longer, more inconveniently, and at greater physical risk in order to get the available goods. The ratio of civilian employment to population, aged 14 and over, increased from almost 48% in 1940 to 58% in 1944, as many teenagers left school, women left their homes, and older people left retirement to work. And I remember that my father's mother said that she was in a factory during the war.
Right, and this is kind of like the groundworks for what you'll see in the 60s. Because, World War I, you did have some intensive circumstances, not nearly what you see here.
Yeah.
So it didn't really affect that much. World War II, they completely destroyed the traditional family unit for about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, right.
It's just gone.
And then they came around with some propaganda
Yeah.
a little bit later
Right.
in the post-war years. Yeah, yeah.
And then, wouldn't you know it, the next generation that comes along, or even some that were around during this time, they don't like the traditional family unit. It's not what they're used to, and they had all these, vulgar freedoms outside of it. It's completely destroyed by these war measures.
Right. This one struck me. He says average work week increased in most other industries. I'm not going to say this word right, bituminous. In bituminous coal mining, it increased by more than 50%. Okay, what happens when you're in a hazardous occupation like mining and you start working people way harder? Take a guess. The rate of disabling injuries per hour worked in manufacturing rose by more than 30% between 1940, pre-war, and the wartime peak in 1943. So people are working longer hours, they're getting injured more because they're tired,
Yep.
right? So he says, it is difficult to understand how working harder, longer, more inconveniently and dangerously in return for a diminished flow of consumer goods comports with the description that economically speaking, Americans never had it so good. So those are the three sort of pillars of the story, which he demolished: the employment story, the unemployment story, the real output story, and the consumption story.
Right.
And in all cases, we see that they imagine this: they play games with stats. Yeah. I know you've never seen that before from our overlords, but anyway.
I pretend to be shocked.
Yeah. Okay. So, and he says none of the standard macroeconomic theories employed to account for the wartime experience provides an acceptable explanation. The models cannot do the job because they don't pertain to a command economy. And the United States between 42 and 45 had a command economy. That is, you have these macro models that are built around free market economic theory, and they try to apply it to a command economy, and they get crazy, perverse results because it's just their assumptions are that prices are real, right? And they're just not in a command economy. So this is more like, and we've discussed this a little on the channel. We could maybe do a show on this sometime. This is more like struggling to understand the Soviet economy.
Right.
Where it's all fake.
Right.
Everything's fake.
The university that I'm at, thankfully, OSU, they are remarkably honest in their statistics and all of that. So they, basically the first course they make you take related to, analytics and all that is if you use this model for the wrong thing, just throw everything out because you just screwed everything up after that.
Right.
And
exactly.
And it's
garbage in, garbage out,
exactly,
as we say in my field. Yeah.
Right. But, they were ruthless on that. Some people just outright failed assignments because they didn't get the right, they were trying to correlate random things without reason.
Right.
So
yeah. You have to be rigorous on these things. Okay. Right. So he says that so all standard macro models assume the existence of functioning markets for commodities, factor services, and bonds. But that assumption fails even to approximate the conditions that prevailed during the war. Commodity markets were pervasively subject to controls, price controls, rationing, in some cases outright prohibition on consumer goods, and price controls, prohibitions, priorities, conservation limitation orders, quotas, set-asides, scheduling, allocations, and other restrictions in the market for raw materials, components, and capital equipment. Rothbard emphasized in his World War I as intellectual fulfillment that they really got their rocks off on being able to control everyone with all these wartime measures. Well, as you pointed out, World War I was a dry run for the U.S. You have to be careful. Europe's a very different situation. Yeah. But for the United States, World War I is just a taste of what happens in World War II. World War II is everything they did in World War I jacked way up. Much more control, gazillion regulations. You can't hardly move without breaking a rule.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And here's something else on here. And it came to my mind because it used the word prohibition. That had been repealed by now.
32, I think.
Yes, that sounds right. However, during the war, would you guess, they restricted alcohol production. that
I didn't
grain
think about
needs
that.
to be going to the soldiers, not towards your
Making beer or something. Yeah.
So my big shtick for like the past couple of months or so is that the progressive movement that you saw earlier in the century, the 1900s, 1910s,
Right.
was just an ethnic conflict between the English descended Germans in the Midwest and the Great Plains.
Right.
Prohibition was one of those measures because what's an integral part of German culture?
Right. Beer and wine.
And wine, yes.
Yeah.
So outlaw that. Well, that's not popular across the country.
Right.
Like it's not just Germans that like beer and wine.
Yeah. Right.
Or anything else. So gets repealed by FDR, and consequently, out in places that weren't dry counties, you would see people would be happier. Deaths would increase, but there's an argument to be made there. Was that because of the alcohol or something else? We don't know. And you also see these communities start to be a little bit more cohesive, because you get this sort of malaise between 1929 and about 1931, where everything's just kind of disintegrating, because you have all these people out of work, families are going hungry, and you also have families falling apart. Well, now you've just given them basically their bread and services in the form of alcohol back. When you get to the war, well, now you have a reason to just reinstate that, and everyone loves it. So the progressives have been fulfilled here. This is kind of like the culmination of one of their ethnically targeted policies.
Right.
Basically, this is the last straw on Americanizing the Germans.
You're saying many things are snuck in under the guise of wartime measures.
Yes.
Sorry, guys, gotta do it for the war.
Right.
We didn't want to do it. But the war just forced our hand.
And as you can see, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, we have no problem producing more food than we need.
Yeah, right.
But also, when we get to World War II, we now need to ration grain because we don't have enough grain.
Yeah, right. Okay, what else does he say? Again, painting the picture of how artificial the economy was during World War II. Credit markets came under total control as the Federal Reserve undertook to reduce and allocate consumer credit and pegged the nominal interest rate on government bonds at a barely positive level. That is, an inflationary, low interest rate, high inflation kind of situation, right? Which we've discussed a lot. In sum, the economy during the war was the exact opposite of a free market system.
In case you need that spelled out to you.
So let's wrap this up because we have a little bit fun tag at the end of this once we finish this article. Okay, so what did happen? We walked through all these details. Now Bob Higgs is going to say, having critiqued, the Orthodox story, taken it apart piece by piece, I'm going to tell you what I think happened during the war economically. And he's just going to lay it out in pretty straightforward prose. As the 1940s began, the economy, although substantially affected by various government intrusions, remained one in which resource allocation for the most part reflected the operation of the price system. Okay? So we're not black and white thinkers, even though we'd love to have a pure free market or whatever. We can see when something has a functioning price system, though compromised by New Deal measures and so forth, and when it pretty much almost doesn't have a price system, even though it's still functioning in pockets, right? And he's saying we went from one part of the spectrum over to the other part. So by the beginning of 1943, the economy had become a thoroughgoing command system, and this persisted until the fall of 1945, when the controls began to come off rapidly. Again, the point Ryan made so well. Now we see emergency measures put in place and they just sort of stick. But back then, there was still the idea that these were temporary and they should end when the crisis ended.
You see, you've had a taste of life before the 9/11 emergency measures.
Yeah, right.
That predates me by 2 years, and it's still going.
Exactly. Although some persisted, some of the controls, the overwhelming mass of them had been removed by 47. So they drop off really, really fast. From 45 to 46 is a dramatic decline in government spending and controls. And he's saying by the end of 47, it's pretty much, we're back to normal.
And you'll see this
as normal as the United States economy was.
With FDR's successor, Truman, you will see this because he, coming back to, like, with the vengeance kind of, they got rid of all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then one of Truman's campaigning points was like, we need to renationalize steel and all
Yeah.
of these other things.
That was weird.
Because everything was so great during the wartime, we can just do it again now that we're in domino theory land.
Right,
So,
right. For the Cold War or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so within a single decade, it is really an interesting period. Just stepping back a little bit, think about this. Within a single decade, the economy had moved from being mainly market directed to being nearly under the complete control of central planners to being mainly market directed again in 10 years.
Yeah.
It's really a dramatic, sort of almost an economic experiment, a live economic experiment. So whenever you view any economic measure spanning the 40s, you're trying to look at numbers going through the 40s about consumer spending and employment, stuff like that. You have to keep in mind the full revolution of the institutional framework, this in and out of a command system. Because the meaning of such measures as the unemployment rate, GNP, the consumer price index, depends on the institutional setting to which they relate. So that's really what Higgs has brought to us here is, he says, if you just sit down, take the official numbers, you're going to believe this crap story about the 40s, the economy in the 40s. He says, you got to be smarter than that.
Right.
And recognize that 1943 was a little bit different than 1949.
Right.
So, again, he lays great emphasis on the details of the war state. That's a theme in Robert Higgs' other work. From mid-1940 to mid-1945, he's trying to give you a sense of the outpouring of munitions from the United States. From mid-1940 to mid-1945, munitions makers produced 86,000 tanks, 297,000 airplanes. What? That's like an airplane for every man, woman, and child. Anyway, 17,400,000 rifles, carbines, and sidearms, 315,000 pieces of field artillery and mortars, 4,200,000 tons of artillery shells, 41 trillion 400. Am I getting that? I'm sorry. Billion. Sorry, 41,400,000,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 64,500 landing vessels, 6,500 other Navy ships, 5,500 cargo ships and transports, and vast amounts of other munitions. So he says, despite countless administrative mistakes, frustrations, and turf battles, the command economy worked in the sense of producing war stuff.
Right.
As always, a command economy can be said to work only in the sense that it turns out what the authorities demand. This is a very important point because I think people think that, like, as you said, so, you know, with Truman with the wanting to renationalize steel, it's like, well, we were able to produce a bunch of tanks when we, like, turn the whole economy into a tank producing machine. Yeah. So therefore we can just, like, do anything with the economy. Well, okay. There's a problem with that. It reminded me of a line from Cato's letters, which are really a joy to read, by the way, if you ever get a chance. He's talking about. He says, "Is it a crime to be rich?" And he says, "Certainly, if it's at the public expense or the danger of the public. The revenues of a king may be too large." And then he says, he builds up in this wonderful bit of prose that I've never forgotten. He says, "Good God, what hard-heartedness and barbarity, to starve perhaps half a province, to make a gay garden." Maybe he was thinking of the Versailles, the gardens of Versailles, which I visited. What is his point? He's saying that, yes, you can produce something really marvelous if you don't care about the cost at all.
Right.
Right? You can squeeze a bunch of people and produce something and have it, and ignore what it cost us. Come and look at Versailles. It's so beautiful. Or come and look at all our tanks and all our planes we made. Aren't we amazing at producing things?
I'll go to something even more esoteric.
Yeah.
In the history books, if we go to ancient history, they will just flat out say early civilization, or these city-states and all of these ancient kingdoms function in a command economy.
Mm.
And it's so great because look at the Egyptians built the pyramids.
Yeah, right.
Command economy. You have the the hanging gardens.
Right.
Command economy. Most of these things were by command economy, and for whatever reason they never stopped to think like, but was that worth it? Was it good?
Yeah,
like,
right.
Yes,
what was the cost?
We have these giant triangular prisms in the sand in the middle of the desert. That's really cool. Like I'm sure that whoever got entombed in there really loves it. But
right.
like Would you
What
want
about
to,
everybody
yeah,
else?
would you want to live there? No.
Right.
Was it? Do they have a? Is there society like lasting? No, not really.
Right. So yeah, I mean, takes us too far afield, but really quickly, I've noticed there can be an archaeological bias.
Yeah,
Like, because this civilization produced like cool archaeological stuff,
yeah.
then it must have been like really great to be
The
there.
best. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, well, I'm not sure that when I think about the part of my life that I'm happy about, I'm thinking about what will people find of it, what, 5,000 years from now.
Right.
You know, right? I mean, maybe there were some happy villagers somewhere that didn't leave much archaeologically, but had a great life.
Well, yeah. And medieval Europe
Yeah. Right.
been completely, mostly destroyed by warfare. Firebombing. A lot of the houses weren't durable, wood and thatch and all of that.
Right. Right.
But as a lot of people in our sphere have been pointing out, it wasn't terrible. Like
Yeah.
there's
Right.
a lot there
Number
that
of
you don't-
hours worked was
there-
less, and yeah.
and there's a lot there that you don't see by just looking at what we uncover from the earth,
Right.
and what we can look at in terms of material, which is sort of the same coin really. What archaeology and then material.
Right. So let's be clear here. What he's saying, U.S. economy did produce war material in quantities sufficient to overwhelm enemy forces. So if all you want to say about World War II is the United States produced a lot of munitions, which, as I understand, you're going to know this better probably than me, but this wasn't just for American troops.
No.
They were
We
sending stuff over to
the
England,
Soviet
over to the
Union,
Soviet Union.
The
Yeah.
French resistance.
The U.S. Wartime economy became a munitions machine for all the allies.
It would probably be easier to list who we didn't send guns
Yeah,
to in
yeah.
the war that were on our side, because we were sending stuff to the Dominions in the British Empire. We were sending stuff to all the resistance movements. We were sending stuff through the Arctic to the Soviets
Right.
or the Siberians.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Through Siberia.
or
Yeah.
through Iran. Yeah, sending stuff to the Chinese.
Right. Right. So right. If all you want to say about World War II is, was the United States able to produce a lot of stuff and help the Allies win the war? Higgs is saying, yeah, well, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's not the claim. The claim is that the war ended the Depression and people were doing better in their personal lives
Right.
and stuff. And he says, and that's what he's knocking down here. Okay. So, right. So from 1941 to 1943, real gross private domestic investment plunged by 64%. That is investing in businesses for consumers as opposed to wartime business or wartime production. During the 4 years of the war, it never rose above 55% of its 1941 level. Only in 1946 did it reach a new high. Investment is often, this is the reason he's emphasizing it, investment is often a good measure of how an economy is doing. When people are investing in the private economy, people are
Right.
getting employed, goods are being
And it's-
produced.
This
Well,
goes beyond,
this domestic investment dropped
Right.
during the war.
and that goes beyond just letting go up. That's literally you are preparing for your future or your family's future. You're investing in capital so that you can produce more. That's not just, oh look, the line's gone up. That's you planned.
Right. So, the mobilization of World War II became a classic case of guns displacing both butter and churns. So, last thing to cover here. Yeah, let's wrap this up. So why? Sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, so why did people, evidently almost everyone, think that prosperity had returned during the war? So he's saying our measures tell us that it was after the war that the Depression really ended. But a lot of people felt like they were better off during the war. Well, he says a couple things. Everybody with a desire to work was working, even if they were basically slaves,
Right.
military slaves, right? Conscripted. Full employment relieved a lot of anxieties because there'd been more than 10 years of persistently high unemployment, right? The national solidarity of the war effort, though it decayed after the initial upsurge of December 7th, 1941, it helped to sustain the spirits of many who otherwise would have been angry about the shortages. So we're doing without, but it's because we're all pulling together and
Right.
fighting the Japanese.
Socially,
and so forth.
everything's great except for a few groups.
Right. Yeah. Right. Except for people who are being put in camps. Okay. So Third, some individuals were better off, although the average person was not. So he gives an example. Many of the black migrants from the rural South who found employment in northern and western industry, right? Because, like you said, a lot of people going to the urban areas, war
Right.
production centers. Some of those people, maybe their jobs were just better, right? But in general, on average, it wasn't an improvement for
But-
people's well-being.
Yeah, you have to contrast those people that actually made it in the urban lifestyle to, the farmer out in the Great Plains who just had like half his family conscripted,
Yeah,
so now
right.
has to farm
Right.
with old machinery that you can't get new stuff for, and the prices have been like arbitrarily placed. So,
Right.
how much do I need to produce? Well, they just told me this. How much did that cost? Oh, good God.
And his working age children are off fighting the war, possibly not returning, or at a factory
Right.
producing weapons or something. Many people at the bottom of the consumption distribution could improve their absolute position despite a reduction of the mean, the middle. And this is this last one is a really striking point, I think. He says, even if people could not buy many of the things they wanted at the time, they were earning unprecedented amounts of money. And what he means is absolute dollar amounts because of inflation.
Right.
So perhaps money illusions fostered by price controls made the earnings look bigger than they really were. In any event, people were building up bank accounts and bond holdings while actually living worse than before. They were feeling wealthier. So he's saying to some degree, people will be fooled by, what do we call it? It's real purchasing power, right? They're not looking at what they can really do with their money. They're just saying, hey, there's a lot of digits in my bank account. So that feels good, even though they can't do anything with
Right.
it. And then once they do finally go to spend it, they're going to find that everything's inflated. And,
Oh yeah,
you know.
yeah. Even if the prices didn't adjust, like even if they did just have more money,
Mhm.
you're just gonna buy the junk that's been approved to sell. The seven
right.
corners have been cut. You're not gonna buy a new car. You're not gonna buy like all this great new land unless you want to be a government worker.
And then he says, what he thinks might have been the most important factor of all, the performance of the war economy, despite it being command and control. It broke the back of the pessimistic expectations almost everybody had come to hold during the seemingly endless depression. I mean, bear in mind people's state of mind after, let's see, when the war started, it would have been 12 years straight of depression
Give or
from
take,
1929 to 1941, right? Roundabout. So, yeah, kind of depressing. So, in the long decade of the 30s, especially its latter half, many people had come to believe the economic machine was irreparably broken. And I think that is the time where people thought that American people might actually go for socialism, and somehow it didn't really happen. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, because it was happening around the world.
Yeah.
At that time. That's why it wasn't crazy to think that socialism would become really popular with this depression seemingly showing that the free market economy couldn't work.
Yeah, during the last century, most countries had like an explicitly socialist labor party or a workers' party that grew. We didn't really get that.
Yeah.
The only real thing that we got, I think, was in like Minnesota with the Farmer Labor Party, but now they just caucus with the Democratic Party. So.
All right. So the frenetic activity of war production, never mind that it was just a lot of guns and ammunition, dispelled the hopelessness. People began to think, if we can produce all these planes, ships, and bombs, we can also turn out prodigious quantities of cars and refrigerators. So when the controls began to come off and the war ended more quickly than anticipated in 1945, I didn't know that. I didn't know that people were expecting it to drag out longer. That's interesting.
Yeah, so.
You knew that?
We didn't just let Japan and Germany like sign peace treaties, we'll just do this normally. It was
unconditional surrender. Yeah.
Which that was considered a terrible strategic move because that prolonged the war, who knows how long.
Yep.
And then the public didn't know about the nuclear bombs.
Oh, right. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah. Which, so unconditionally surrender, and we're going to firebomb like Dresden and nuke Nagasaki and Hiroshima, all the Christian centers.
Yeah, right. Which we've been talking about, yeah. Okay, so when the controls began to come off, the war ended more quickly than everybody expected in mid 45. Consumers and producers launched eagerly into carrying out plans based on rosy forecasts, and by doing so, made their expectations a reality. So there was a sort of a confidence that we did that, we can build this economy back up. And they did. The post-World War II economy actually was really strong.
Right.
And he demonstrates some evidence of the expectations from the stock markets. During the war, the stock market had not recovered from its 1939 level by 44. But then by early 1945, people were starting to expect the end of the war, and that started to see some investment, stock prices going up in 45 and in 46. And yeah, so he says, did people expect the end of wartime prosperity to be economically deleterious? Obviously, they didn't, based on their revealed preferences of investing in the stock market. They're like, ooh, I want to get on this because I think when the war ends, we're going to be rocking. Right. And they were right. It did. So to sum up, World War II got the economy out of the Great Depression, but not in the manner described by the Orthodox story. The war itself did not get the economy out of the Depression. The economy produced neither a carnival of consumption nor an investment boom. However successfully it overwhelmed the nation's enemies with bombs, shells, and bullets. But certain events of the war years, the buildup of financial wealth, in their bank accounts, and the transformation of expectations, justify an interpretation that views the war as an event that recreated the possibility of genuine economic recovery. So as the war ended, those factors came into play and real prosperity returned. So you had the shrinking of the state, the pulling back of controls, wartime command and control over the economy, people coming out of the war going, all right, we're going to do it.
And you also had really low time preferences.
Yeah, right.
Because people had learned,
all these years in the Depression.
Yeah, and depression, rationing, people aren't used to just consuming.
Right. Yeah. We have to remember different people back then than what we've become since then. We've fallen so far. Okay, so that's that story. But as I mentioned, there's something else to a little rabbit hole to go down, which is, okay, sure, sacrifices were made to win the war, but
it was necessary.
We had to win the war against the Japanese and the Germans, and we had to do it in that way. That's the part I wanted to challenge, and thankfully, I found just the quotes I needed from my friend Bob Murphy. War is no excuse for socialist planning. Do we need government to design a war economy? And he pulled out just the passages from Mises I was going to spend a long time not finding, probably. And so here's what Mises says in Human Action. What America needed in order to win World War II was a radical conversion of all its production activities. All not absolutely indispensable civilian consumption was to be eliminated. The plants and farms were henceforth to turn out only a minimum of goods for non-military use. For the rest, they were to devote themselves completely to the task of supplying the armed forces. Well, that means we got to have a command economy, right? Mises says, no, it does not. Did the government need direct control of industry, Bob Murphy asks, in order to manage the war economy? Mises says, no. The realization of this program did not require the establishment of controls and priorities. If the government had raised all the funds needed for the conduct of war by taxing the citizens and by borrowing from them, everybody would have been forced to cut down his consumption drastically. So that would have, by taxing and borrowing, that would have shifted to state consumption as opposed to consumer consumption.
Right.
Okay? But not by telling everybody exactly what not to consume, but just letting people adjust that way, right? The entrepreneurs and farmers would have turned toward production for the government because the sale of goods to private citizens would have dropped. The government, now by virtue of the inflow of taxes and borrowed money, the biggest buyer on the market, would have been in a position to obtain all it wanted. Okay, so this is a little mind-blowing because we probably this is a piece of the boomer truth regime we probably didn't even realize was in our head, which is that the government had to take over the economy to win the war. And Mises said, No, it didn't. Rothbard has a long piece from 1950, which I decided not to go into on this same topic. Um, because remember, real prices are useful. And what the US did is it abolished those real prices essentially during the war by price controls and abolishing production of certain consumer goods and so forth, right? And so it essentially tried to replace the price system. And, it pulled it off well enough. But Mises said they didn't need to do it that way. It would have been more efficient to make use of the price system. And that is, rather than telling people, you shall not consume this and you shall not consume that, and you'll do this and you'll do that, and you'll have these ration cards and all this stuff, you just redirect, using taxation and government borrowing,
Right.
you redirect what the economy is focused on, in essence, and then you let everybody make their individual adjustments. This would have resulted in almost certainly better results in terms of wartime production and probably less misery for everybody.
Right.
Because people would have, of course, naturally made decisions that made more sense for them and their family and their community,
Right.
while still adjusting to these new priorities. So I hope this is a little bit mind-blowing for you, because this is not the story that we generally get told. That you can have a sort of a market-oriented way to fight a war.
Right. Well, and going beyond that, that's just the production front. You also have manpower that you have to deal with.
Right. And so Bob Murphy goes on to talk about the draft. And he says the logic of voluntary market arrangements in regards to war production holds in the case of conscription as well. So he says, suppose a foreign nation has amassed millions of soldiers on the border and is preparing to invade. Wouldn't even a classical liberal government have to hold its nose and impose a draft on its citizens just to deal with the emergency? The answer is no. To see why, change the example. If a foreign nation drafted millions of its people into working on collectivized farms, would the United States need to do the same if it wanted to grow more food? Of course not. The way to maximize food production, especially if we care about quality, would be to get the federal government out of agriculture as much as possible, right? The United States, despite a lot of CIA bonker reports and stuff, the United States had better agriculture than the Soviet Union, despite, as you pointed out, agricultural adjustment acts and all
Right.
kinds of banana stuff. But still, United States agriculture was far superior to
And
the Soviet agriculture.
I was just going to say one word.
Yeah.
We have a relative, compared to today, very little government intervention into farms, throughout the last century compared to today. And I've just got one word to back that up, and it's seed oil production.
Anyway, yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole. Okay. So I hope you're following his point, right?
Yes.
If we think in terms of agriculture, we know that the way to beat the Soviet Union in agriculture was not to imitate them and repeat the famines that you always get when the commies collectivize agriculture.
Right.
Right. We were able to feed ourselves pretty well through that whole Soviet period, and feed the world, in fact, right?
Right.
So hopefully you've grasped that. Now let's bring it back to a military struggle. Bob says a similar pattern holds in military struggles. A free society could easily defend itself from, say, 2 million poorly equipped conscripts with little training by using only, let's say, 100,000 elite volunteer troops supplied with advanced weaponry and vehicles from 400,000 civilians working in factories cranking out helicopters, body armor, tanks, and artillery. Foreign dictators' reliance on a large labor-to-capital ratio for their military hardly means that is an efficient practice for a freer nation to emulate. So I love that. All this is so great. I feel like it's hopefully causing some paradigm shifts in people.
Right.
Because it's just simple-minded to just go, well, the dictators they'll have so many people. They'll just, what's it called? The Chinese wall or whatever, the
human wave.
Human wave offensive. Yeah. They'll just overwhelm us with bodies. And it's like, think about the U.S. military, for instance. The U.S. military can take care of, could respond to something like that.
For each body that they throw at you, you need at least one bullet.
Yeah, right.
Or or one bomb or something like
Yeah,
that.
right, right.
You don't have to just think 1-to-1. Oh, men needs to be matched with men. Well, no.
Right, right. So
That's the whole theory of warfare: is you try to find ways to outsmart.
mortars or the cannons or the trebuchets,
Right.
they seem to win a lot.
And here's something else. We, being as we're the people that covered Connaught Ladine,
Yeah.
look back to the medieval societies and all that. Who were the best fighters? Very few standing armies. The best fighters were always mercenaries.
Mm-hmm.
Mercenary being, they weren't affiliated with one state, one country, one nation, or one kingdom, fiefdom, whatever. They were their own group. They were hired. Literally private army. They were always the best fighters.
Right.
Even up until very recently as well. And you can still...
Well, they're kind of going back to it.
Well, yeah.
I don't know if you've known about BlackRock.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So, we lost that knowledge for whatever reason in the last 200 years. French Revolution. All of that. Yeah.
For whatever reason. We know exactly why. Yeah.
And you can still see some of the cultural acknowledgments to mercenaries being the best fighting force. Who guards the Pope?
Yeah, right. The Swiss guard. Yeah. Exactly.
So,
right. Yeah. Because of the French Revolution, we briefly lost the knowledge that conscription is really a bad idea.
Right, yeah.
It's really inefficient and ineffective.
Right, and then if you win, you have to, repair what you just removed for, the past whatever wartime you just were in. Because those people were doing something earlier. Usually you conscript peasants, farmers, miners, things like that. People that are, doing things that are necessary. Then you don't have them for the wartime.
Right.
And when you go back, now they have to reintegrate into society. And you also need to make up for what you just lost.
Right. So let me just give you one more paragraph from Bob's article. And by the way, I realize I haven't shared links. I'll do that in just a moment. To the Robert Higgs article and then the Robert Murphy article. He says, we must always remember that government edicts do not create real resources. All they can do is divert resources into different channels from what the voluntary market process would have produced. Besides, as a nation relying on free labor, where anyone can accept or reject the terms of employment or negotiate for a better deal. Academic Agent recently turned this up from, I'm going to forget his name, one of our elite theorist guys, but the American. Burnham, yeah. Burnham writes he's writing in 1941, and he's sort of pre-Boomer Truth regime there. And he's pointing out that the Allied, like the French and the Americans, could not get people to volunteer.
Right.
And they turned to conscription.
Right.
And I now in the case of the U.S., I think they went to conscription immediately. But in the case of the French, I think they tried to do volunteer first and then gave up and were like, we just can't get people. They don't want to do another one of these, and they turned to conscription.
Yeah, and the governments weren't helping themselves. Who wants to fight for the French Republic? It was dysfunctional. No one liked it. Everyone hated whoever was in for whatever reason. No one was happy with it, so no one wanted to fight for it. You have to force them to. In the United States, what's one of your biggest pools of conscription labor? It's the Germans. Who are you fighting against? The Germans.
Right.
That you just tried to radically suppress over the last few years. It worked somewhat, but they weren't completely done.
Anyway, the reason I brought that up is one obvious question would be, well, if free military labor is so great, why didn't the United States use that more efficient free military labor? It's because people didn't want to go.
Right.
A thing that gets forgotten, and I hope in your historical work you dig into this, but Ralph Raico taught us about this. A thing that gets forgotten is that the World War I revisionists basically won the day, and some of those names you would know.
Yes.
Harry Elmer Barnes, I think, was one of them.
Yeah.
The World War I revisionists basically won the day, so that by the 20s, going into the 30s there, Americans knew that World War I had been a false, we'd been tricked into it, and it was not the moral crusade that it was painted as, the simple black and white cartoon moral crusade.
Right.
They had really done a great job at undermining the narrative around World War I.
And they had
so that's why the greatest anti-war movement in the history of the United States was the America First movement.
Yes.
Because everybody, including people like the young JFK, all
Yep.
kinds of names you'd know, were part of America First because they were like, we do not want another stupid European war.
Right. Yeah.
So it was not easy for them to just say, okay, time to go back to Europe
Right.
again. Come on, guys.
It's-
It just they had to force them.
And it says something when you get someone joining on his own volition, a national hero, Charles Lindbergh, that joined the America First movement very fervently as well.
Yeah.
And so you had that kind of group. You had the Roman Catholics. They hated intervening in Europe, especially the Southern Roman Catholics. They saw it as like a financier's game, which usurious. And then you also have the farmers. They hated this. Every time we go into a war, the farmer suffers. And then, as we saw with the miners, they're getting their limbs destroyed. They're getting their bodies destroyed every single time we go into war. This happened in World War I, by the way. We talked about the massive percent increase in mutilation happening to the miners. Happened in World War I. Happened in all these other wars that we went into.
Pressure to work harder, longer, for the war effort.
And then it takes a very special kind of soldier to just want to go over there.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're going to have a lot of them.
You always have your Pattons,
right?
Who just basically are up for war.
Well,
right?
with Patton, you have to With Patton, you have to remember, he's not as belligerent as some people make him out to be. When the war starts, he's ready to go and finish it. But he wasn't really too terribly vocal about going over to Europe and going over to Japan and finishing the whole thing ourselves before we got involved.
Oh, okay. Okay, anyway.
Sorry.
So we could go on, but we're going to wrap it up because Ryan's going to join us for dinner, and I remembered you got to see my library. I was excited to show you that. It ends over there, by the way.
It's wonderful.
And then, but I haven't shown you my my bar, so I need to show you that. Because I make cocktails for my wife and I.
There's more.
There's more to show you. So we're going to get to that. Let's see. Let's go back to here and give me just at least one. So let's see.
We got like a thank you super chat halfway through.
Okay, so I want this and this. Okay, sorry folks. Just a moment to pull these up. All right, unsubscribes. Oh no, that's last time. Okay. Wait a second. Did we read this one? Oh, he did this a day later. Okay, catching up on one from Mickey, responding to the agriculture stream with Marcus Furious last week. Mickey says, great stream tonight. What I gather now is that the production structure of agriculture as a whole is more or less collapsing. I would then guess it's time to buy agricultural stocks and become the winner of this crisis. I cannot see how overall agricultural production doesn't plummet in this environment. So wait, he's saying it's going to plummet, but you should buy them? I'm not sure I'm following his logic.
If you want to take over an industry, you do it while it's failing.
Well, it's fair. Okay, I see. Yeah.
I mean, that's how I understand
buy it when it's down.
Yeah.
Okay, I follow your logic, Mickey.
Just,
keep contributing when you make money off of my ideas. Okay. Okay, and then we have 4 super chats. I think we read this one, right?
Yeah, the Fed posting.
Yeah. Thank you from Blood on the Blade for suggesting that Canada should be at war. Okay, and then Jimmy Thomas talked about it being called in Canada, again on the Canada topic, the War Measures Act, which I didn't know. Anti-Commie says, glad to see you, Ryan. Oh, I read that.
Yeah.
The sniper stream. And then finally, Indy, very generous contribution. Thank you. Thankful for you both, your knowledge and your uprightness. Enjoy a few beverages of choice on me this weekend. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
I certainly shall, along with my wife. Okay, so I think that's all for today. Next week should be Econ Minis. Maybe we'll, I just thought, I agreed with Black Horse. It was just too juicy of a topic for this show not to talk about the effects of Trudeau starting to seize assets,
right?
Or credibly threatening to seize assets in Canada. Really wanted to just spend a few minutes on that. Having said that, too early to say what the impact of that is. Maybe by next week we'll have a little more concrete and can cover it as part of our current events Econ Mini Show. Another one, Sam153 Cheers. Enjoy the weekend event. Thank you, sir. Um, yeah, wow. Good super chats. Having you here is helping, Brian.
Wonderful.
Okay, so that's all. Our regular super chats are great. If you're a supporter on Subscribestar, you can send tips, and you don't have to let Google take a big bite out of that. And then support on Subscribestar is really nice. People subscribe and typically send us $5 a month, but enough people do that, it adds up. So thanks for your support for the show, and so good to have Ryan with us. He's generally on Thursdays in a class, so it's an unusual week that we have him this semester. But we hope to see more of him soon, and I think that's it. Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.